Last week, we made a video on Europe's chronically low wages. And when we were writing that one, we came across this data, showing real wage growth across the EU in 2022. Obviously, in general, things don't look great, with real wages declining by an average of about 4% across the continent. But one place that fared remarkably well was Belgium, where real wages actually rose by 2.9%. Not only that, but Belgium has also enjoyed relatively strong GDP growth since the pandemic, with real GDP increasing by just under 6% since the end of 2019, well above the Eurozone average and neighbouring countries like France and Germany. In 2023 alone, Belgium grew by 1.5%, triple the Eurozone average, and well above its forecast. This is made even more impressive by the fact that Belgium is already a wealthy country, so it's not like any of this growth can be attributed to its catching up. According to IMF data, Belgium has a GDP per capita of $56,000, slightly behind the Netherlands, but ahead of Germany. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why Belgium's economy has fared relatively well, why it's mostly due to its unique wage indexation mechanism, and what the rest of Europe can learn from it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into it. The main reason that Belgium's economy has fared better than most of its Eurozone peers is actually quite simple. Its unique wage indexation mechanism. In short, in Belgium, wages automatically increase in line with inflation. Now, technically speaking, wages increase once the 4-month average of so-called health index exceeds a certain threshold, usually 2%. For context, the health index is very similar to a normal measure of inflation, known as the consumer price index, which measures the changes in price of a so-called basket of goods and services that the average household might buy. The health index does the same thing, but it strips out certain goods like alcohol, tobacco, and petrol. Anyway, while there are a couple of exceptions, this indexation mechanism covers the vast majority of private and public sector employment. This makes the Belgium system almost unique in Europe, because while there are other wage indexation mechanisms in some other European countries, Belgium has probably the most comprehensive indexation mechanism around, with the exception of maybe Luxembourg, which has set up a similar scheme. Because while wage indexation clauses are common in collective wage agreements in Spain, for instance, they only cover around 2/3 of private sector contracts. And while France has a complicated indexation mechanism, it mostly just applies to minimum wage workers, who represent less than 15% of private sector employment. Anyway, this is actually the main reason why the Belgian economy has fared as well as it has recently. Like other European countries, Belgium has suffered a decline in exports over the past few years, both because the global economy has slowed somewhat, which means that demand for goods and services has declined generally, but also because of a global rise in protectionism across the world. Countries like the US, China, and others are increasingly resorting to tariffs and other measures to protect their domestic industry. And this has been bad news for Europe, both because European industry used to rely on foreign markets to make up for Europe's lackluster domestic demand, as evidenced by the EU's recurring trade surpluses, and because Europe has neither America's fiscal firepower nor China's state capacity to protect its domestic industry. However, unlike, say, Germany, Belgium has been able to make up for this shortfall in foreign demand with domestic demand, fueled by strong wage growth. And this is a reoccurring theme. Almost every time we do these videos about a certain European economy escaping Europe's wider economic malaise, it usually seems to be, at least in part, because they've seen stronger wage growth, which has allowed them to offset any decline in exports. This is in part because, as much as politicians tend to focus on them, in most developed countries, exports account for a relatively small fraction of GDP, and most economic activity is driven by the domestic economy. Now, at this point, you might be asking, if the data is so clear-cut, why doesn't everyone just try and stimulate wage growth? And why doesn't everyone have a Belgium-style wage indexation mechanism? Well, there are a whole load of reasons, but the big one is that governments and central banks worry that strong wage growth, and wage indexation mechanisms specifically, could increase the risk of so-called wage price spirals, where inflation leads to higher wages, which means stronger demand, and therefore more inflation, which leads to higher wages, etc. In fact, wage indexation mechanisms used to be pretty popular in Europe, but lots of countries got rid of them in the 70s and 80s. This is largely because inflation increased dramatically in the 70s, thanks to the Arab oil embargo in response to the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which triggered a fourfold increase in the price of oil, going from about $3 per barrel to about $12 per barrel in a year, and then to a high of $40 in 1979. In many of Europe's oil-importing countries, wage indexation mechanisms help to exacerbate wage price spirals, leading to unpalatably high levels of inflation and social unrest. And the ECB today even advises against them. However, while inflation in Belgium has been a bit higher than average, peaking at 12.2% in October of 2022 compared to 10.2% for the Eurozone, it actually came down remarkably fast, falling to basically 0% in October 2023 compared to 2.9% in the Eurozone. Now, since then, it's fluctuated around the 3% mark, higher than the ECB's 2% target, but nowhere near the kind of levels that might trigger a politically destabilizing wage price spiral. And the ING reckons it will fall to 2.1% in 2025. Rather, the main problem that the wage indexation mechanisms have caused for Belgium has been its impact on state finances, which are looking increasingly strained. Not only does the indexation mechanism require steep increases in public sector salaries, but it also forces the government to keep headline inflation low, and this has recently involved spending lots of money tamping down energy prices. While Belgium's energy support package doesn't look that generous at first glance, it was supplemented by steep tax cuts, with VAT on electricity and gas going from 21% to 6%, and this has really weighed on Belgium's public finances. Belgium ran a deficit representing 3.6% of GDP in 2022, but this rose to 4.2% by 2023 and is due to rise further to 4.6% in 2024. While this is over the EU's 3% target, it wouldn't be that bad were it not for the fact that Belgium already has a pretty hefty debt burden, with national debt over 100% of GDP and rising. While Belgium isn't at an acute risk of a debt crisis anytime soon, perhaps the general lesson here is that in the 21st century, the main risk of a wage indexation mechanism isn't a wage price spiral, which have been conspicuously absent from this recent bout of inflation, but rather an unsustainable strain on state finances. Now, obviously, all of that is pretty complicated, but hopefully our analysis has made things a little clearer. Making videos like this requires a whole load of effort and research to uncover what's really going on, before then summarizing that into something that makes sense for everyone. But that's an expensive process. Running TLDR this year has cost just under £800,000, which, when your main product is free YouTube videos, is quite a lot of money. If you want to support our journalism into 2025 then, one of the best ways you can do that is by picking up a copy of our magazine, Too Long. That's because buying Too Long doesn't just get you a high-quality magazine, it also allows you to invest in independent journalism and join us in shaping the future of news. Now, this most recent issue focuses on the 29 biggest elections of this year, making sure that you understand what really happened in this mega election year, and commemorating one of the biggest years in news. We don't just discuss elections though, we also run through China's trade issues, Biden's successes and failures, the UK's new opposition leader, and the state of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Plus, the fact that it's a magazine means that we're not constrained by the time limits or algorithms imposed by YouTube. Unlike fleeting news cycles and algorithmic feeds, Too Long offers thought-provoking analysis and comprehensive coverage that's truly worth holding. So if you're convinced, you have 3 more decisions to make. Firstly, do you want a physical or a digital copy? The physical one is a high-quality 60-page perfect bound magazine, shipped right to your door. But the digital is slightly cheaper, especially if you're concerned about shipping. Your second choice is the standard or premium edition. The standard is just a copy of the magazine, while the premium issue gets you access to our behind-the-scenes monthly podcast, The Bullpen, where we break down all of the production that goes into Too Long and TLDR more generally, as well as getting your name printed in the thank you section of the magazine. And your final decision is if you want to subscribe. If you do, you'll get a copy of Too Long every 4 months, meaning that you'll never miss an issue. Plus, you'll also get 25% off every copy as long as you stay subscribed. If you can, subscribing also gives us a reliable income stream, which is super useful for us. Regardless of which option you choose, you can buy a copy right now at toolong.news or by clicking the link in the description. As always, thanks for your support, and thanks for backing Too Long.